Hello, EA Student Summit people. I'm going to give a quick presentation on effective altruist epistemics research. There's going to be a very brief overview. If you want any more information, please do contact me. This is very much a very quick thing to get more conveyed. But contact me if you're interested, because there's a lot more to go into, but it really depends on who it is and what your interests are. So first, a quick warning. So this topic is messy. There aren't that many EAs who are currently paid to work full-time in this area. A lot of it has worked kind of on the sidelines for a long time. A lot of the people have either gone into other fields or are doing like commercial things and were able to find their work to be valuable. However, in the future, it seems like the way that things are going is that there is more focus in this area. Another warning is that it's just like a really messy area. So there's no great boundaries between what one thing is and what another thing is. I'm calling it epistemics. It could also be called meta research. It could be called maybe decision making, how to effectively do research. There are a lot of ways to interpret it. So right now, the terminology is not very common among people. And it's not just us. It's basically when you go to a lot of philosophy, a lot of academia, the terminology is definitely spread out between a whole bunch of industries, and it's quite hard to put together. So whole area is quite messy. The EA funding landscape is quite messy. That's what a new paradigm looks like. So there are exciting things about that. Now is a great time to kind of come in, make an impact, to help flesh out what it should be as it starts to get formalized. But do expect things to get messy. Another aspect is that it's hard to make this talk for a wide audience, right? Because different people want different things. Often I find that technically minded individuals are interested in research or technical careers, right? Like the software engineering side. And then on the other hand, we have maybe sociology and psychology and even like contemporary philosophy. And they have other approaches and things to say, but the people of that mindset are typically interested in very different things. Hypothetically, it'd be great to have people who do all of the above. But of course, those people are quite hard to find, and arguably it takes more academic discipline than anyone has the money or time to do so far. So yeah, expect, not just for this presentation is a very small subset of the much bigger space. It's going to be a much bigger project to try to summarize that in any legible shape or form. But in general, just going the whole field right now is quite messy, and there's a whole lot of work to do to both demystify it and also advance it. So let's try and let's just do our best. Slide one. Well, real slide one. So people on the outside may look at EA research or other kinds of research and say that there are two phases, right? There is a research and then there's an implementation. So on one hand, you'd be paying researchers, and then every so often, maybe the researchers around animal welfare will lead to actual actions being taken, whether they be protests or legal action or just going out and building animal shelters or building areas for animals to be happy and whatnot. There are two basic boundaries. But when you get into it, it's a lot more complicated, right? So here's one breakdown where you have, instead of just research, we could imagine like having different types of research. One challenge is that now we just have a whole lot of effective altruist researchers. And there are a whole bunch of other research organizations that are around effective altruists. And in the future, we may want way more researchers than that, both within this group and outside of it. And it's not obvious at all how to scale that and what infrastructure we may need, and if we're using the best techniques. It's very possible that right now we're using techniques that are just way underneath where we really would need to be to get the results that we want to achieve. And that may be the kind of thing that maybe we need ML or advanced, like very advanced systems to really help with. So one thing we could do is to start divide this space out into a few subfields. We could kind of look at these as like, if this were an engineering organization, there'd be kind of like an internal tools team, making engineering for the engineers. In more research organizations, you may have like a meta research team. This is kind of trying to scope out what that looks like. So on one hand, we have what I'll call epistemics here. Epistemics it's a messy term. Typically within some of the EA communities, people use the term epistemics to mean like good thinking. Within the literature, of course, epistemics refers to more of like what you know and how correct that knowledge is. And I think that's generally a fine cluster to call that field, but it'll be, it's arguably about decision making, you could put a lot of things into it. It'll make more sense in a few moments. The next thing is prioritization. So this is just one way to split it out, but there is a lot of global priorities or just figuring out what EAs should be working on. Arguably, the community has been kind of focused on this for a while, but arguably it hasn't. There actually aren't that many people who are working full-time in just figuring out where EA resources should go in the next 5 years. A lot of the existing prioritization efforts are quite more theoretical different from that. So it's an area that could be developed further. So obviously, like if we could think better, we could prioritize better. I think splitting them out is kind of nice, and then both of them feed into direct research. And it gets more complicated. This is still, of course, a very simple overview. So let's make it a bit more complicated. So we could just separate epistemics into a bunch of subcategories. These are 4 that kind of made for the effective altruist community based on buckets that people have been talking about. But of course, the actual list would probably go on to be way further. Then EA prioritization or global priorities, and then direct research. So in epistemics, a few of the buckets are, and these are definitely overlapping. You have rationality, that's kind of like the less wrong crowd. There's a bucket called institutional decision-making, which you've probably seen a little bit about. Forecasting is a pretty active area, and then quantitative analysis, which gets messy, but arguably people are getting into that. Within prioritization, then it's you have a theoretical end, which is more like GPI, the Global Priorities Initiative. You have fundamentals, which is kind of messy. Arguably, fundamentals are just epistemics. I was just making the boxes to be to put where I think a lot of people would imagine them. But fundamentals here would be the basics of, say, how can we use Bayes and how can we use like information theory to better get a sense of how to do fundamental estimates of prioritization. Long-termism, which here I basically mean what 80,000 Hours and Ben Todd have been doing. So you could see in the 80,000 Hours podcast, Ben has been doing some pretty interesting work trying to like define the different kinds of long-termism. And then what I'd call direct use, which is really like, oh, let's just start applying all these principles to specific decisions that we have available to us. Maybe doing things like, oh, here's a list of every single thing that we could be researching for direct research. Let's just get an expected value of marginal money or funds or whatnot for each one of those fields. And then all of that hopefully leads to direct research, which of course is like, all the ways of improving the world. Of course, one interesting thing is that a lot of this work may not just be an internal tools type work. A lot of internal tools in software engineering become so successful that they leave their company that they're part of, and then they get sold to other groups. So for instance, Slack actually started out as an internal tool, and then it was just so successful that they decided to spin it out, and that became their main thing. One reason why I bring that up is because I think that a lot of the thinking that effective altruists have done around epistemics and prioritization are valuable enough to not only be useful to EAs, but also to be useful to other people. There's also a separate concern, which is that maybe some of the work that we do shouldn't just be on coming up with stuff that is useful to us. Maybe it's even just taking stuff that we already know and just trying to publicize it to other groups. So arguably, a lot of the institutional decision-making focus is more on that latter side, which is, at least the stuff I've been privy to has been much more like, we kind of know what works, at least to some extent, but we really would like other government actors to know it as well. So let's go straight to them and try to make sure that they have a better sense of things. Very arguably, I think with COVID, we got a lot of experience in exactly how poorly run some of the bigger actors could be, and how much some of the techniques I think effective altruists have been using could really be applied and could really be helpful if they are used over there. So going through the list, just very quick overview. So when it comes to rationality, the main group is less wrong. They're the ones who've been using the word rationality. It's not exactly obvious what the distinction is between rationality and decision-making in these other fields, but there are definitely clusters of thought, and where each cluster has its own thinkers and its own take on things. So within rationality, just go to lesswrong.com. It has a lot of discussion. It could be kind of difficult to get into in the beginning. Eliezer has really been the main pioneer behind the website. He kind of started it. So his books are online, definitely recommended. Rationality from AI to Zombies is really the recommended thing. However, it is like very long, and arguably it would be great for this to be made into a textbook one day in a much more formal language, but right now there's no one really available who would be a great fit for that and who has the time. And that also raises a point that within rationality, there's a lot of progress, but there's also a whole lot of work to do. So if you're interested in doing things like that and formalizing it, either get in touch with me and I'll try to refer you to the right people, or just go one less wrong and start being active. The next thing is the elephant in the brain. And this really gets into Robin Hanson style research. I bring this up in part because it's been pretty influential in the community, I think, in the last few years. It's been talked about a lot. Of course, a lot of the ideas that he's talking about are ideas that have been going back a much longer time. Arguably, he distills them in a very good way. But it is like a small glimpse in like a much bigger paradigm of how should we think about how humans think and what our biases are, and how we signal things to each other in terrible ways or in great ways. One reason why that's important is because it may apply to ourselves, right? It may be that we, when we're doing research, may be deeply flawed and maybe we're going about everything incorrectly. I think that ideas of the elephant in the brain would get into like that type of paradigm would help inform us in ways like that. I imagine there's a whole lot of work to be done to actually just flesh out the ideas of this book. If you read it, I think you'll notice that it's still like quite early, meaning that a lot of the ideas are very much just ideas. A lot of them don't have any scientific rigor yet. And that doesn't mean it's bad for the book. It just means that it's like the beginning of what could be a nice research paradigm. The next thing is that I'll like point to is like there has been a lot of work that's not just popular books by the main people. In this case, there's a paper categorizing variants of Goodhart's law. So less wrong is interesting. A lot of the focus of a lot of the intellectual thought has been on AI safety, but a whole lot of it is still applicable to organizations and individuals, just to be more correct about things. This is one paper that obviously, like Goodhart's law, is applicable to any organization, any group. So that kind of research is could be quite useful for just general epistemics. And it also kind of tells you something the other way too, that if we're able to become much better at epistemics, it could also help out AI safety efforts and similar. So there's a lot to think about there. The next thing is institutional decision making. So the main EA group that's funded right now to work on this is the Geneva Science Policy Interface. I'm absolutely sure now that I'm forgetting something very fundamental, and I'll get criticized a whole lot after this talk, but whatever. I very much apologize, and just keep in mind that this is like very much something that I put together in a few hours. It's not supposed to be definitive. It's supposed to be just like a very quick overview. But anyway, back to them. My impression is that they're doing interesting stuff. They were just founded very recently, and they've been doing research and also like actual application of trying to figure out what techniques are most useful in policy, and then trying to make sure that they actually get used in policy. There's also clearer thinking with Spencer Greenberg. So Spencer is giving a talk, I believe, or it seems to be doing a whole lot at this summit. I don't know if he would consider himself in institutional decision-making or maybe just decision-making. Like I said, the whole space is kind of fuzzy, but it is like a clearly different and unique spin on things that's quite distinct from the rationality community typically. Yeah, he has a bunch of tools. They're typically focused on individual rationality or individual thinking from what I can muster, but it's definitely like an interesting group. And then a lot of what's happening in institutional decision-making now is just people going into institutions and trying to make them more correct, basically. So there are several people, especially in the UK scene, who have just joined interesting organizations and are trying to help improve them from within. The next cluster is forecasting. So this is something that I've been working much more closely in. And it is probably the area that's, of the four mentioned at least, that has exploded the most within effective altruism. But it's still fairly small. So the main book on this subject that's easy to recommend is Super Forecasting by Tedlock. And that is a pretty good overview of the Good Judgment Project and their initiatives and their research and why this field is important and why it's interesting. One thing about forecasting, as it's discussed, is this is really judgmental forecasting. Like forecasting arguably is like arguably all of ML, all of data science is forecasting, a whole lot of speculation is forecasting. But when effective altruists talk about it, typically what they mean is judgmental forecasting, or really like human-based forecasting. Judgmental, of course, is another one of those like terrible words that a lot of people think that it means that we're judging them or something, and that's not what it means. But it's what's been used within some of the academic literature. But really here what we're talking about is like, how do we answer these big, vague questions where we don't have huge data sets? And in order to do that, the super forecasting literature seems pretty solid. And since then, there have been a bunch of attempts on different platforms. These are just a few of them. Metaculus is highly recommended. If you haven't checked it out, that's probably the easiest one to recommend that you look at. It's a common platform that has been getting a fair bit of money from the EA funds. And one reason for that, and by open fill, and one reason for that is that they're asking a lot of questions that this community is interested in. So it is kind of questions kind of custom made for you if you're interested in these similar topics. So it is just pretty interesting. The next thing is OUGHT is really like the biggest EA related nonprofit in this area. So they kind of started out doing AI safety, and right now have changed to working on forecasting tooling and other kinds of forecasting research. So if you're an engineer, or generally if you're interested in doing forecasting research and you want to work with an EA group, that is probably the biggest group out there right now. I think they have a team of about 6 to 9 people. It has seemed to be changing quite quickly. So yeah, they're pretty exciting, I think. Next 2 groups. So we have Fortel at CSET, which isn't really a group, it's more of a project. CSET is in DC. They're doing pretty interesting work around AI policy. Fortel is their prediction platform for basically forecasting AI-related policy things. And then there's a social science prediction platform that Evolved and a few other people have been working on. And there are a few things like this. In this case, it basically helps social scientists make forecasts about which studies will replicate and a few other factors like that. And that's some pretty exciting work right now in that area, I think. On the bottom are my projects. So I've been working on Foretold, which is a open source prediction platform. It's much more focused on research use cases or experimental settings. And then the Squiggle language, which is kind of like an improvement on Guesstimate, which I'll get into in the next slide. So sorry, that didn't work out quite well. But basically, Squiggle is an experiment in what the future of estimation inputs would be. And that's important because it could be very nice to forecast using them. It's a whole topic, though. It's kind of technical. There are blog posts about it, so I'll post them, or there's at least one right now. I'll post that in the notes if you're interested. And then the final of these 4 is quantitative analysis. So arguably there's been less EA focus on making tooling in quantitative analysis, but there's definitely discussion, and arguably there could be a lot more focus going forward. So the main book, they're kind of like 2 buckets that are the obvious to begin with, arguably. Although you could definitely argue that data science is by far the bigger thing. So I would say that these are 2 of the most like unique things to effective altruists, arguably. The first one is Fermi estimation. So I've seen there's another talk or 2 basically about back of the envelope calculations. The naming is quite messy around all of this. It's not obvious what exactly a Fermi estimate is still compared to what's called a model, right? A lot of people would say that their estimates are models. Some others would just say that they're back of the envelope calculation. It's very much like a gradient between the 2. But if you want to understand that better, I think that the book How to Measure Anything goes into a pretty good detail in how to think about these questions. And then I've worked on an app called Guesstimate, which is free to use publicly. If you want a private code, just contact me. And basically that helps you do Monte Carlo simulations in order to do quick estimates of different types. Several effective altruist groups have been using that to do estimates of different kinds, often cost effectiveness estimates on different charity interventions. And then the next cluster is Bayesian methods. So on one hand, you have MCMC and Monte Carlo sampling languages. So that's important when you want to do inference, which is a very specific thing when you have some data and you want to make assumptions about it and inferences on it. It takes a while to fully explain, but it is a very isolated but specific and very powerful approach. There's a much bigger industry around that than around Fermi estimates, which means that there are more tools, but it also means that arguably there's less additional gain for each other person to get into it. If you're interested in that, I recommend this book as like a way to get involved, like just to get started. And then there's Andrew Gelman's books, specifically the one on Bayesian data analysis, I want to say. That's like known as like the gold standard, although it's quite a bit more difficult. So that's the very simple summary. I'd say that we have a long way to go. So I think that it's very easy to look at presentations and to talk to a few people and get a sense that we've kind of figured it out. That right now, like effective altruists have kind of settled on a few different cause areas and way of looking at the world. And we kind of have all these cool tools now. So all we need to do is to apply them everywhere. And I think that that's not exactly correct. Very arguably, we may have some gigantic gains to be made. It's very possible that maybe 5 to 10 years from now, we'll realize that we were completely mistaken and have to really think about things from scratch. I don't think that there aren't any other groups that to me seem more likely to be correct. Obviously, I'm part of the EA cluster, so I'm biased and have faith in it. But there's still, I'm sure that there's a lot that we're getting wrong, and I'm sure that there's a lot in terms of like ways of discerning different areas that we have that we could go from here to there. To give you an example, right now we kind of think about things in terms of cause areas. So we may say that like AI safety is good, but climate change isn't good. But obviously, a much more impactful way of looking at it would be to say, oh, there are actually these 20 very specific things within AI safety that are important. And there are these 5 within climate change. Climate change is huge, but there are actually like a few very specific things in it that are actually tremendously impactful. And that's really where we would like to get, but it is a whole lot of work to get there. It's just more work to get more sophisticated models of things. But that's one reason why, arguably, if we had much better tools and if we had much better capabilities and research practices and understanding of how to do effective research, then we could more effectively actually just get there. That not only means that our researchers now will become more effective, it also means that because like each researcher hour will be effectively cheaper, so it could be sensible to spend a lot more money on these kinds of research activities. So it could be that if we're able to get things to a certain point, it could be worth investing a whole lot more money on doing fundamental stuff. And in the progress, what that would look like, hopefully, is the development of a whole lot of really insightful work. So arguably, we're just beginning. There's a long way to go. In terms of the techniques, I mean, all the things I showed you, none of them use advanced AI yet, right? That's obviously something that people are thinking about that needs to get done at some point. And then arguably a whole lot of it hasn't been the subject, as I said in the beginning, of a whole lot of solid research efforts for ongoing amounts of time. A lot of it has been more like either side projects or like groups that are kind of on the periphery, or like a few people within things, but typically most effective altruist research has been focused on direct work or some prioritization. A lot of this stuff has still been kind of overlooked. So arguably, if it were able to be looked at, it's possible we just have like a huge amount of progress ahead of us. We just really have to see it. And that's one reason to do not get complacent with the current stuff. There really just may be huge advancements to be had still. Hopefully, I think that if we're alive 50 years from now, if any of humanity is, they'll look back at this point, not as a time that we figured it out, but as a time that we were just starting to realize what was going on. So that was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed that. Again, do feel free to reach out to me. One of the big challenges with giving a talk like this is that different individual people have very different things that they care about and things that would make sense to tell them. So do feel free to reach out. I'm happy to have a chat with you. Your career is important. I hope that this was useful for you. Thank you.